The last year or so, Apple has added a lot of great features to the iPhone, and I'm talking more about the video side. But I've been wondering if some of these features, like ProRes, for instance, are before their time. Not that they're not ready, but are the users, is the audience for this feature ready? So let's talk about it. Hey guys, Blake Calhoun, and another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about mobile filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, indie filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. And yeah, a lot of great features with the iPhone, and including the apps like Filmic Pro that support the iPhone or that work on the iPhone. I've been thinking recently, are they ahead of their time? And let me explain what I mean by that. So I mentioned ProRes in the intro. ProRes is a great professional codec that filmmakers like myself have been using for, gosh, I don't know, 20 years. It's been around a long time. And it is, typically speaking, again, more for professional use. And there's this weird quandary that if you follow this podcast or my iPhone channel, my YouTube channel, you know that it's something I've been tackling for the better part of 10 years. And that is using your mobile device, your iPhone in this case, as a professional production tool in professional scenarios. And while I've done it for all those years in various ways, it's getting to the point now where you can use it, especially for indie filmmakers or YouTubers, etc., as your main device, if not one of your main devices. However, in the professional world, it still hasn't been embraced nearly as much as I honestly thought it would be. And I think part of that is there's such great offerings on the mirrorless camera side, the affordable cinema camera side, to where it's great to have an iPhone, but because you can get an awesome camera for, I don't know, $1,000, a Sony mirrorless camera, etc., it doesn't necessarily make sense to just have an iPhone since you can get the other stuff that is better quality for sure at this point in time. But that's all to say that that doesn't mean that the iPhone won't be there, that the technology is advancing so quickly that I think it'll be there sooner rather than later. And in many ways, it's already there. So back to ProRes and why I think it may be ahead of its time. A lot of people have kind of poo-pooed ProRes on the iPhone. And I think the main reason is the file size, and they are big. And part of that, of course, is getting the files off the actual phone. And it is a pain. It's a total pain. And so ProRes, I think, was maybe ahead of its time on the actual device, meaning because it's so hard to get off the phone, especially if you shoot a lot of it, one or two clips here and there is no big deal. But I just did a short film. I shot the whole thing in ProRes, and it was a one-day shoot. I don't know exactly how much I shot, but it took about, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, maybe longer, to get all that footage off my phone. And that's not great. That's not great at all. If it was just going across from a traditional camera off an SD card, I think it may have been 60 gigs or something like that. That would have taken, I don't know, 5 minutes or less. So ProRes may have come early to the iPhone because they don't have a good connection like a USB-C or a Thunderbolt. And so iPhone 14, my hopes are that a USB-C or Thunderbolt will come. But some of the early renderings I've seen, the drawings that get released on Twitter, etc., are showing a lightning cable. So I'm going to be super disappointed if they don't do it. It really doesn't make sense. Why would you put ProRes on that phone and then not have a good way to get files that run at what? A gigabyte, a minute, or something? I can't even remember it. But I still shoot ProRes, and I think ProRes is great. The second part to that is the sensor. And so while the sensor has been greatly improved, especially starting with the iPhone 12, of course, you can't shoot ProRes on the 12 Pro, I should say, 12 Pro Max, actually. The 13 Pro and the 13 Pro Max are the same camera this year. But the idea that you can shoot ProRes, but then the sensor still is a phone sensor is another part of the challenge, another part of the debate. And you're using computational imaging. And so it's not the same as shooting ProRes on a traditional camera. Although And this is why I kind of wonder why people don't use it as much. If you're doing something that needs some heavy color grading, or if you're doing effect shots like a green screen or even a visual effect shot in a movie, having ProRes at your fingertips now on your phone is really awesome. And now Filmic Pro has log, ProRes log. That's that next step in the advancement. And it is great too. You're still dealing with the small sensor. And so, you still have issues in low light. It's much, 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 much better in low light, but it's still not as good as a traditional camera in low light, even using computational imaging. And so the sensor and then the getting the files off the phone are definitely negatives to shooting ProRes. And then the original thing I mentioned too, because other cameras are so affordable and easily accessible, in some people's minds, there's really no reason to use a phone since you can have a Sony mirrorless camera. And I get that argument. In my work, and I talk about this a lot, for the most part, like on this YouTube channel or my main YouTube channel, or I'm shooting a podcast right now, but if you're watching this on YouTube, I use my iPhone primarily as a B camera and a B-roll camera in my that type of work. Same with any kind of corporate and commercial work. I primarily use traditional cameras for that work, but I absolutely incorporate some iPhone shots, typically on gimbals or B-roll shots or second camera angle shots. And I think they work fantastic for that. And in those situations, especially on higher end work, I would shoot ProRes. And so what I'm hoping, and again, why I say that ProRes may be ahead of its time, is that the phone is going to work its way into that world, meaning the phone's going to get better. And so more and more people may use it. And I mentioned app makers, and I'm specifically talking about Filmic Pro. And I did mention ProRes Log, and ProRes Log is awesome. I've been very impressed shooting ProRes Log. Not the same as shooting on a traditional camera, but it's pretty close. It's pretty darn close. You just don't get the same dynamic range. You see into the shadows better. They can get noisy. The highlight roll-off is not the same as a traditional camera. But for color grading or visual effects and stuff, it's a great option to have. A lot of people aren't using it though. And that's kind of my overall point. I say a lot of people, what I mean is in the professional ranks. And that's really what these features are geared towards. Casual users probably don't care about ProRes Log, and they probably really don't care about another update that Filmic Pro did recently, and that's Frame.io. It's another feature that I think is outstanding and great, and I've used it, but it may be a little bit ahead of its time, on the phone that is, because it's really geared towards people who are using their phone in professional scenarios. And again, a lot of people aren't doing that. So with Frame.io integration, you can use your phone and shoot and simultaneously upload to the cloud. And then an editor or a client or whoever can see the footage as you're shooting at the same time, instantaneously. Now, on a larger shoot, that is incredible. Let's say you're shooting on an Alexa or even a Blackmagic camera, and you can do that too with those. They have hardware that you can attach, or now Atomos has a monitor. I think it's called Atomos Connect, where it's a monitor that you connect a Wi-Fi connection to. They sell a new enhancement or attachment to that, which is awesome. So then you would be shooting with whatever camera, your Blackmagic camera, connect it to the Atomos monitor, and then that would upload to the cloud. And it does proxy files. And that's what Filmic Pro does. And so Filmic Pros is a watered down version in quotes because of the quality of the camera. So that Frame.io integration, while amazing, probably won't be used as much in the professional ranks because people don't shoot that much professional stuff on a phone. Corporate video, I think you would or could right now, and maybe for sure in the future. And mobile journalism, a lot of those guys do right now too. And I had a debate on Twitter with Mark Settle and Glenn. Glenn runs Mojo Fest, and Mark's a BBC guy. And they don't see it as being useful right now. And, they're in that world, and so they would know better than me. But it's probably because a lot of those guys are independent and solo shooters. And in that case, you probably wouldn't need it. But if you're working with a team and you're out in the field, let's say you're doing something in Ukraine and you have your phone and you're shooting incognito, you connect to Starlink or whatever, upload your files to an editor back in London or even at a hotel in Kiev, and they can start editing right away before you get the files back to them. To me, it's a no-brainer. And I could see, I mean, even the big networks in America use phones here and there. In Australia, I know they use them a lot more than they do here in the States. And so over time, though, all these things, ProRes, Frame IO, bigger sensors on the phone, more storage space, 5G. 5G is another thing too, where I think it will be embraced sooner rather than later. And so all these features right now are a little bit ahead of the curve, but it's great to have these at our fingertips now, but they will be used a lot more, in my opinion, in the future. But guys like me and people like you who probably follow my channels, we're pushing what you can do on a phone and have for, like I said, about 10 years. Most people obviously shoot their home movies with their iPhone, but you can do so much more. And I think as time goes on, especially as the hardware improves, because the apps are already there, but as the hardware improves, and I've heard the rumor of 8K coming in the iPhone 14 Pro. Now, I don't want 8K necessarily. The file sizes, speaking of big file sizes, that's going to be pretty crazy. But cinematic mode, the big drawback to cinematic mode on the iPhone 13 is it's HD only and only 30 frames per second. Well, if they do allow 8K on the next iPhone or offer 8K, then perhaps they could make that into a 4K cinematic mode that will then also offer 24p. And cinematic mode, I'm not going to say it's ahead of its time, but it's an early iteration to first generation, and it works surprisingly well in the right scenario, especially for product B-roll or even interviews if something's not moving a lot. And you have smooth edges. You don't have like a tree branch or a bush or frizzy hair. The cutout is actually really good right now, and it's only going to get better. So that's not really ahead of its time necessarily. It's just an early iteration of that that's going to continue to improve. So all those things together, though, make a phone, again, a professional camera that we carry in our pocket. It can go anywhere in the world, just that much better. And ultimately, as someone who considers himself a mobile filmmaker, but also a traditional filmmaker, it's just invaluable to have all these tools at our disposal. So I would encourage you, if you have a 13 Pro, to use it, to use ProRes, to use Frame IO or give it a try, to use cinematic mode. And over time, and again, especially when the next phone comes out, next couple years, I think that a lot of that is going to carry over into traditional cameras. Again, kind of like the using LiDAR and cinematic mode, but then also the stuff we're doing today will catch up in the future. So I like being ahead of the curve, and I like being on the cutting edge, so to speak, and using ProRes on an iPhone. I definitely think you are. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments if you're on YouTube, and if you're on the podcast, hit me up on Twitter. Are these features ahead of their time, or is it the case where people are maybe ignorant of them? And I don't mean that as a pejorative. They just don't know how to use them. Or is it that we need to learn more about it and we need to make people more aware of them? Probably a combination of all three. At any rate, I'm extremely glad that we have them, and I look forward to them continuing to improve. Just a couple housekeeping notes. My short film that I shot with the iPhone 13 Pro and ProRes Log, and I used Frame IO on it, I've talked about in a couple of my iPhoneographers YouTube videos. That'll be coming very soon. I said at the beginning of May, and right now it's May 13th. And so that is coming probably within a week. Also, everything I talked about in this video, the Frame IO, the ProRes, etc., I have done videos on. And so be sure to check those out if you haven't seen them on my iPhoneographers YouTube channel. And on this, if you're watching this on YouTube, on this channel, I have a lot more videos coming that I've been trying to figure out a good plan for, but a couple of them are going to be related to my studio shed. I still owe a video about how much all that cost. I have a lot of people asking me about that. I just haven't sat down and put pen to paper. And so that is coming soon as well. In addition, I've kind of talked about this Cinematography 102 course that I've been working on. My Cinematography 101 course has been popular on my website. I have several courses. If you follow this podcast, you know. But the 102 course, I'm still working on, but I may pivot into making that about a real world scenario, and that is how to make a short film implementing those ideas and those techniques versus just a straightforward training video or training course. I'm debating that right now. The way I approach everything is very pragmatic, and I like using real world examples. And this new short film, I'm really proud of it. It turned out really well, and it is a good real world example, but it's also something that you guys could do too. I always like to use examples that aren't like Marvel movies, you know what I mean? A lot of filmmakers will show these kind of examples that are just really out of reach for the average person, or really not even the average person, for 99.9999999% of us. It's cool to see how they do that, but in the real world, most people don't get to do that. It's great to dream, we all dream, but in the same breath, it's also good to be a realist and learn how to do things and show how to do things that we can all actually accomplish and achieve. So that's my idea, and probably going in that direction on this one. So that's it. Just been thinking about how the iPhone might be a little bit ahead of its time. The iPhone video features, that is, along with Filmic Pro, some of their features. Great features, but I don't think they're being used as much as I would hope yet. But I think they will be in the future, especially as the hardware advances. Well, this has been another episode of Almost Professional. I'm your host, Blake Calhoun. Thanks for listening, and I will look forward to talking to you in the next episode.